It is 3:17 in the morning, Persian Gulf Standard Time, on February 28th, 2026. Somewhere beneath the black oil-dark waters of the Gulf of Oman, a Virginia-class submarine glides silently through the thermocline layer at a depth of roughly 400 feet. The crew hasn't slept in 36 hours. The combat systems officer is staring at a tactical display that shows 11 Iranian surface combatants, frigates, fast attack craft, and patrol vessels clustered in a loose formation east of the Strait of Hormuz. These ships are conducting exercises. Their commanders are confident. They've spent years drilling for exactly this scenario. The moment the Americans finally push too far, on the bridge of the IRGC frigate Iris Sahand, an officer lights a cigarette and gazes west toward the dark silhouette of the Iranian coastline, 47 nautical miles away. He does not yet know that in approximately 4 hours, his world will no longer exist in any recognizable form. That same pre-dawn hour aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln CVN 72, the air wing is already cycling through final pre-flight checks. 11F 8ES, 18ES, 18E Super Hornets sit fueled and armed on the flight deck, their weapons bays loaded with AARGM-ER joint standoff weapons and GBU-32 joint direct attack munitions. The ship's commanding officer receives the execute order. He reads it once, folds it, and hands it back. He doesn't need to say anything. Every officer in the Combat Direction Center already knows. 1,400 nautical miles to the north. 1,400 nautical miles to the north. In Virginia and at CENTCOM's forward headquarters in Doha, Qatar, targeting officers have been working for 63 consecutive hours cross-referencing satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and acoustic data to build what military planners call the kill chain, a complete, precise, fully validated list of every Iranian naval asset that can be reached in the opening volley. That list has 1,000 targets on it, and the first Tomahawk cruise missiles are already airborne. This is the story of how a war was decided before it was declared, before a single Iranian commander reached for a radio, before a single IRGC speedboat was scrambled from its dock, before Tehran's state television could even run a breaking news chyron. In the age of modern naval warfare, victory is not earned in the moment of contact. It is manufactured months, years, sometimes decades in advance. And what Operation Epic Fury exposed to the world, in brutal, satellite-verified clarity, is that the United States Navy had been quietly, methodically preparing for this exact engagement since at least 2019. The Iranians never had a chance. Not because the Americans were necessarily faster or braver in the moment, but because every critical decision had already been made for them before the first shot was fired. To understand why the U.S. Navy already won, you have to understand the doctrine that made it possible and how differently the two sides had been preparing for this moment. For decades, Iran built its naval strategy around one foundational concept: asymmetric denial. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, established in 1983 during the grinding chaos of the Iran-Iraq War, was never designed to fight a conventional fleet engagement against the U.S. Navy. That would have been suicidal. Instead, Tehran invested heavily in harassment, attrition, and psychological disruption. The IRGCN developed swarms of small, fast surface craft, the Ashura class, the Tari class, and the dual Jana speedboats, capable of rushing a carrier strike group from multiple directions simultaneously, attempting to overwhelm the defensive envelope of Aegis-equipped destroyers with sheer volume. They stockpiled an estimated 6,000 naval mines of varying sophistication, from Soviet-era contact mines to advanced pressure-detonated seabed weapons. They converted container ships like the Irish Shahid Mahadavi and Irish Shahid Rudaki into floating forward operating bases, what Iranian planners called Bavar ships, capable of deploying drones, ballistic missiles launched from hidden deck containers, and anti-ship cruise missiles from within civilian shipping lanes, specifically to complicate Western rules of engagement. The Qadir cruise missile, with a claimed range of 330 kilometers and a payload of 200 kilograms, could be fired from one of these nondescript commercial-looking vessels with virtually no warning. The Fatah 360 ballistic missile system, designed to saturate point defense networks, was publicly demonstrated in February 2024 in a provocative live-fire exercise designed to rattle U.S. naval commanders in the region. The Iranian strategy was never about winning a decisive naval battle. It was about making the cost of intervention so high, in ships damaged, sailors killed, oil prices spiked, insurance rates exploded, that Washington would hesitate. The IRGC-EN's doctrine explicitly prioritized extraordinary problems over extraordinary victories. They planned to hold the Strait of Hormuz, 21 nautical miles wide, at its narrowest point, with a navigable channel less than 2.5 miles across, as a kill box. They planned to seed mines across every deep-water corridor in the Gulf. They planned to launch drone swarms and missile salvos simultaneously to exhaust U.S. interceptor magazines. The plan, on paper, was coherent. It was also built on one catastrophic assumption: that the Americans would fight the same war Iran was preparing for. They were not. While Iranian naval commanders were rehearsing asymmetric harassment in shallow coastal waters, the United States Navy was conducting a fundamentally different exercise, not tactical preparation, but strategic erasure. For years prior to February 2026, U.S. naval intelligence officers working under the Fifth Fleet's headquarters in Manama, Bahrain, had been building what is known in targeting doctrine as a complete order of battle, a granular, continuously updated map of every Iranian naval asset, its location, its readiness state, its physical vulnerabilities, and its precise GPS coordinates. E-2D Advanced Hawkeye aircraft, operating from carrier decks hundreds of miles offshore, provided persistent radar coverage across the entire Gulf. MQ-4 Sea Triton unmanned aircraft flew long-endurance surveillance missions at altitudes above 55,000 feet, feeding synthetic aperture radar imagery in near real-time to analysts in Doha. Virginia-class submarines, arguably the most capable undersea intelligence gathering platforms ever constructed, patrolled the deep-water approaches to the Strait of Hormuz for months, mapping Iranian submarine movements, recording acoustic signatures, and quietly confirming the exact berthing positions of every major combatant at Bandar Abbas and Kanarak. By the time Operation Epic Fury received its execute order, U.S. Navy targeting cells had not merely identified Iranian naval forces, they had been watching them, characterizing them, and preloading their coordinates into guidance computers for weeks. The Tomahawks were programmed before the political decision to fire them was even made. That is the critical insight that most coverage of this conflict missed. The U.S. Navy did not respond to Iranian provocation. It executed a pre-built fire plan on a timeline entirely of its own choosing. When Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Dan Kane stood at the Pentagon podium on March 2nd, 2026, and said matter-of-factly, the first shooters at sea were Tomahawks, unleashed by the United States Navy, which closed in on Iranian naval forces and began to conduct strikes across the southern flank. He was describing the activation of a targeting architecture that had been loaded, aimed, and ready to execute for months. Every ship, every base, every bunker, already in the system, already solved. When the strikes began in the early hours of February 28, 2026, the speed and precision of the U.S. Navy's opening volley was genuinely unprecedented in the modern era. Within the first 48 hours, CENTCOM confirmed that all 11 Iranian warships that had been operating in the Gulf of Oman, frigates, fast attack boats, intelligence-gathering vessels, were destroyed or had fled, not reduced, not degraded, gone. 2 days ago, the Iranian regime had 11 ships in the Gulf of Oman. CENTCOM's official statement read, "Today they have 0. the clinical finality of that sentence, issued on social media like a corporate quarterly report. T captured something profound about the nature of what had just happened. This was not a battle. It was an accounting at Bandar Abbas, Iran's primary Persian Gulf naval base, and the home port for the bulk of the regular Iranian Navy. Satellite imagery captured by Planet Labs and Vantor Intelligence in the hours after the strikes told a story that no state media broadcast could walk back. Multiple fires burned across the pier facilities. The frigate classes, Bayandor, Alvend, and Jamaran, lay at acute angles in the shallow harbor water, taking on water from Tomahawk strikes that had been individually targeted to hit below the waterline. The Irish Shahid Bagheri, hull designation Cone 10C. 4. The converted container ship that Iran had refitted as a drone carrier and had paraded as a symbol of asymmetric ingenuity was struck within the very first hours of the operation, while still at its pier. It never moved. The Iris Makran 441, the large forward-basing ship that IRGC commanders had used to project naval power into the Indian Ocean, was struck at the same pier complex. Iran's much-publicized submarine capability, a mix of Russian Kilo-class boats and indigenous Gadir-class midget submarines, was degraded significantly in the opening strikes, though the true extent of subsurface losses remained tactically uncertain in the immediate aftermath. The most psychologically devastating moment of the entire opening phase came not from a Tomahawk strike or an air-launched bomb. It came from below the surface in international waters on March 5, 2026. A U.S. Navy Virginia-class submarine operating at classified depth in the Indian Ocean near the coast of Sri Lanka fired a single Mk-488 cap torpedo at an Iranian surface combatant. The Iranian warship designated Iris Dena sank within minutes. It was the first time a U.S. Navy submarine had torpedoed and sunk an enemy vessel since World War II. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced the sinking in a statement that characterized the weapon as quiet death. That name was not accidental. It was chosen. The psychological intent was deliberate. A reminder to every Iranian naval officer still afloat that the enemy capable of sinking you might be invisible, might be 40 miles away, might have been tracking you for 3 weeks before you ever knew it was there. By March 13th, CENTCOM was reporting that approximately 51 Iranian naval vessels had been destroyed across all phases of the operation. 60 frigates across the broader conflict zone had been struck or sunk. 30 Iranian mine layer vessels had been damaged or destroyed. The Navy Iran had spent 4 decades building and positioning as its strategic deterrent had been functionally erased in less than 2 weeks. Yet even amid this extraordinary conventional dominance, Iran's asymmetric doctrine produced its intended friction. On the night of March 12, 2026, an IRGC speedboat approached the oil tanker Saif Vishnu off the coast of Kurt in southern Iraq. 40 seconds of recorded video showed the explosion that followed. A naval drone detonated against the hull with precision, setting the vessel ablaze. God is the greatest. Destruction of an American oil tanker in the northern Persian Gulf. A voice on the video proclaimed. Within hours, Brent crude crossed $100 per barrel for the first time in nearly 4 years. The IRGC had achieved exactly what its doctrine promised. Not a military victory, but an economic and psychological strike that reverberated across global energy markets far beyond anything the physical damage to the tanker itself warranted. A single speedboat, a drone costing perhaps $250,000, and the world's largest economy watched its gasoline prices tick upward every day for the next week. By March 13th, an estimate had 400 merchant vessels sat stationary on both sides of the Strait of Hormuz, waiting. The navigable channel, less than 2.5 miles wide, was now effectively a psychological blockade backed by the threat of IRGC mines that Iran claimed numbered in the thousands. U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright acknowledged that a Navy escort program for commercial shipping was not ready to implement yet. Iran's conventional navy was gone. Its asymmetric leverage remained intact. Here is the uncomfortable truth that Operation Epic Fury forces every serious strategist to confront. The U.S. Navy won the conventional battle so completely and so quickly that it barely registered as a war, and yet the friction continues. This paradox is the defining feature of 21st century great power naval competition, and it is a lesson that the U.S. Navy, to its considerable credit, understood decades before Tehran ever did. The Iranian surface fleet, built painstakingly over 40 years to serve as Iran's primary deterrent, was effectively neutralized within 48 hours. Not because the U.S. fought harder in those 48 hours, but because the United States had been fighting that war continuously, invisibly, and without declaration for years prior. Every satellite pass, every submarine transit, every signals intercept, every targeting package refined and revalidated. Victory in a modern naval war is not born at the moment of first fire. It is accumulated quietly and relentlessly in the thousands of operational decisions that precede the trigger pull. By the time a Tomahawk leaves its vertical launch system cell, the battle is already settled. What follows is simply physics. The deeper strategic lesson, however, belongs not to the victors, but to the architects of deterrence for the next generation. Iran's asymmetric doctrine, swarm boats, mines, drone attacks, economic disruption, the manipulation of a 21-mile choke point, was never designed to win a war against the U.S. Navy. It was designed to survive one and to impose costs high enough to make the political price of fighting prohibitive. In that narrower ambition, it has had partial, painful success. A single IRGC speedboat can still spike global oil prices. A single mine can still paralyze a shipping corridor. 51 sunken Iranian warships did not reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The world's largest naval power, operating with 2 full carrier strike groups, 16 surface combatants, and multiple submarine assets in theater, could not simply declare the waterway open and make it so. Clearing mines is slow, methodical, and dangerous even in peacetime. Providing escort for 400 waiting commercial vessels requires more destroyers than the Navy can practically assign. The rules of engagement in a 21-mile strait, with Iran's land-based missile batteries still operational along the shore, limit the room for maneuver in ways that raw tonnage cannot solve. This is the enduring friction of modern maritime power, the capacity to destroy an adversary's conventional navy in 48 hours and the capacity to guarantee freedom of navigation through a contested choke point are 2 completely different capabilities, each requiring different tools, different timelines, and different tolerances for cost and risk. The U.S. Navy already won, in the sense that every metric of conventional naval power confirmed total American dominance before the shooting started. But dominance is not the same as control, and control is not the same as peace. The sailors who prepared those targeting packages, who loaded those Tomahawks, who tracked Iranian submarines for weeks in silent water, they did their jobs with extraordinary precision and professionalism. The question that now belongs to strategists, diplomats, and policymakers is a harder one. What do you do the morning after you win a war that the other side refuses to acknowledge is over? The Strait of Hormuz, that 21-mile ribbon of water through which 20% of the world's oil supply flows every single day, remains the answer that nobody yet has fully given. And in that unanswered question lives the true definition of strategic victory. And the beginning of the next conflict, the U.S. Navy is already, quietly, preparing to win.